some of the loudest voices for defunding the police, dismantling the police, abolishing the police. Someone like a Patrisse Cullors, who is one of the 3 co-founders of Black Lives Matter. After having enough money to completely move out of high crime neighborhoods and buy several houses in, sunny, crime-free suburbs,
right?
Basically, lights the dynamite as soon as they've cleared the blast radius and says, set it all on fire, defund everything. Now that I live in a neighborhood that it will be totally unaffected by that policy change. We should just stop to consider how whenever someone moves anywhere in a city like New York or any major city, always in the top 3 list of your concerns is what is crime like in that neighborhood. Yep. Usually it's number 1, and it can be it's so obvious that it's number 1 that you could forget how important it is to you. So like, I know you lived in East Harlem for a while, right?
Yep.
East Harlem is notoriously one of the, at least in my tenure in New York, has been known as one of the crime hotspots in New York. And the one time, I don't remember why I was walking through East Harlem. I was on 116th and like 1st or something. And in broad
PJ's right there.
Yeah. In broad daylight, I saw a man beating the shit out of his girlfriend.
Wow.
Like 20 feet away from me. And there was no one else on the block. It was just like, I got to walk past that and feel like a coward for doing nothing, but looking at him, he could beat the shit out of me if I tried to intervene. And I don't even know if she would want me to intervene. It could be one of those cases where if I called 911 and everything went, quote, well, she would be cursing me out for, needless to say, I never went back to East Harlem again because that was terrifying. The point.
Yeah, man,
go ahead.
I was gonna say, we moved to East Harlem because we could get a better deal on an apartment there. My wife and I didn't have any kids yet. She was working in East Harlem. It was an easy commute because I was along the 405 and Manhattan Institute's right here outside Grand Central. So it was 3 stops, 15, 20 minutes to get to work. And it was a nice building. It was a brand new building. I think we were the first people to live in our apartment. But, along 2nd Avenue, you had the Douglas houses that were kind of, very much a notorious crime hotspot. On 123rd, you had the Taino Towers, which, again, lots of crime, outside the building on a summer night. It's like half the residents are hanging out outside and fights break out. And, on 3rd Avenue, you've got, a bunch of liquor stores that, some drug dealers hang out in front of. And then 125th Street at the time, I don't know what it's like now, but it was basically like an open air shooting gallery. So it was just, people strung out, laid out in the street, half naked, people defecating on the street, throwing up on the street. I remember one time I was walking to the train and coming into the office and saw this guy, clearly an addict. He was in a wheelchair. And here go these like 3 high school girls in Catholic school uniforms. And he, he's kind of like leering at them. And as they get closer and pass him, he says something just absolutely filthy. And they keep walking in stride as if this is just a regular part of their day. These girls are like 14, 15 years old. And then as soon as they turn the corner onto 125th, he just very casually leans over, sticks his finger in his mouth and pukes an insane amount all over the street and then rolls away and just goes right back to the group that he was hanging out with on 125th. I just remember thinking like, this is right around the time that we got pregnant with our son. And I was like, we can't push a stroller around this neighborhood. There's just no way. By then we weren't even going to the supermarket down the street to go food shop. We would call an Uber and take an Uber down to the Target on 116th,
Jesus.
Get groceries, get back in the Uber because there was like there's this parking lot structure. You didn't have to like go out onto the street. It's like we would walk occasionally, but very, very rarely. And it was really just about a safety concern. But the thing that really kind of sticks in my craw and pisses me off about this whole debate is like, we're lucky. Like, my wife and I, we do well. We've had success. And so we have that option of moving. Like when we got pregnant, it was like, hey, we're going to break our lease. And like, we ended up paying 2 rents for like 2.5 months. And, we could afford to do that. But lots of people don't have that luxury. And it's like, what do we do about them, right? Like they deserve safety too.
Right. All they have in the short term are the cops.
Exactly.
And so,
Exactly.
and I guess I want to raise that to encourage people to think of how important it is to them to not live in a massive crime hotspot, and how much money those of us who are able to, the premium we spend on not living in a crime-filled neighborhood. It's as important to poor people to not live in a crime-filled neighborhood. They just often don't have the options that we have. And so from a place of safety to just say, yeah, we should defund the police, when, as I mentioned in this podcast, people in neighborhoods like that are generally saying exactly the opposite. They're saying either I want the same amount of police, please keep the police presence the same, or often saying I actually want more police presence.
Yeah. I mean, look, and there's also data showing that, particularly in low-income minority communities, that they want better, more equitable policing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a debate to have. I suspect that a lot of responses along those lines are kind of knee-jerk in the sense that they're based on a sort of uncritical acceptance of a narrative that prevails in the sort of mainstream legacy media, right? Like we're kind of told that it's a given that, police violence is a massive problem. We're told as a given that police officers are, racially biased in determining who they stop and who they use force against. And, that I think is frustrating too, because it serves as kind of a speed bump along the path to, safer communities, which is not to say that these are issues that should be ignored or that policing is perfect. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, though, is that we have to, I think, have a more realistic sense of what the scope of the problem actually is, and what is likely to actually fix it. So yeah, you can poll people and find lots of support for certain kinds of reforms. That doesn't mean that those reforms are going to work, and it doesn't mean that that support is reflective of a realistic sense of what the underlying problem is. And so, I'll ask people sometimes when I'm giving a talk, I'll say, like, how often do you think police officers use force when they're making an arrest? And, the answers tend to range from like 15% at the low end to 50% at the high end. If people kind of know my work, and are in the audience, they'll say, they'll say the right answer. But, people who haven't really studied this and are just kind of casual observers, this is kind of the range that they come back with. And yet the reality is that police officers use force in less than 1% of arrests. And it just blows people's minds when they hear that. Well, that can't be true. They'll say like, well, this is police data that you're relying on, right? So they have an incentive to make it look one way. And it's like, well, the police data has been around for a long time, and we've seen a really sharp downward trend over that time. So, they had that same incentive back then, presumably, right? And in 1971, when the NYPD first started reporting how many shootings their officers engaged in, I think they shot 220 plus people. Now I think they discharge their weapon, maybe 24 times across an entire year, even though the population in the city's gone up, the size of the NYPD's gone up. Yeah. And so, that's a massive improvement, one, which is not reflected in the sort of rhetorical posture of our debate. But two, I think it helps kind of water down the concern that maybe there's something up with the police data. The other thing is that you would expect to see an incongruity between the police data on use of force and the surveys of people who have contact with the police and how often they say that they're subjected to uses of force or that they have force threatened on them. And you don't see that incongruity. The statistics match, the rates match. And so, I just, another thing I hope people get out of the book is that, there is a lot more to understanding what the real scope of this problem is. And so the risk of over-defining the problem and overblowing it is that you gin up support for policy experiments that have significant downside risks that, again, are going to fall disproportionately on the places that are most vulnerable to crime, right? When you saw the decrease in pedestrian stops within the Chicago Police Department in 2015 and 16, it didn't really affect things all that much in the Gold Coast and, Lakeview and Wrigleyville and some of the nicer neighborhoods like Lincoln Park. But it really, really changed things in places like Inglewood and Austin and West Garfield Park and Humboldt Park. Like, it's really, really important for us to understand whose lives we're experimenting with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I just see example after example after example of the residents of disproportionately Black, poor, high crime neighborhoods rebelling against this progressive urge towards depolicing and leniency, right? Like, so the election of Mayor Eric Adams in New York is one example. I mean, all he did was run on crime. I mean, his whole campaign summarized in a single sentence was, I've been a cop my whole life. We are going to deal with crime. And, Black New Yorkers elected him in droves over all of the candidates that, to different degrees departed from his hardline stance. And so he took the hardest line and he won handily, right? Precisely with the people that, when polled, in many cases will say that the police are racist and that they want police reform, but they want police presence, certainly,
Right.
and are totally allergic and rebel against the narrative that you see in lots of media outlets, in academia, or like everything you would learn in a policing 101 class as like an undergrad at Columbia University would be rebelled against deeply by the majority of Black New Yorkers. And that's a very interesting fact. It's just like the departure from what is mainstream among academic scholars, outside of conservative think tanks like MI, right? Like at the elite universities, it's just totally rebelled against by most people, including the people that folks think they're speaking for.